Perhaps best known for its agriculture, its state fair, and its bitterly cold winters, Iowa is nestled in between the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. It is one of the United States' most fascinating states for true crime enthusiasts, as it is the backdrop for dozens of decades-old cold cases. In today's episode, we'll be exploring two twisted cases from Iowa that are still unsolved. Cody James and Gary Harker. One day, in December of 1979, Cody James and Gary Harker, both 30-year-olds who had been friends since high school, were painting in James's woodworking shop in Illinois. Later that day, they got into Cody's black 1965 Chevrolet pickup truck to deliver an air compressor to Rock Island, Illinois. In a later interview, the owner of the service yard where the compressor was dropped off claimed that he didn't buy the item, but that whoever had took it away. Afterwards, the two men planned to head to Davenport in Iowa to collect their $500 payment for the task. However, neither Cody nor Gary showed up to collect their payment. In fact, they never came home and were never seen again. Fast forward a few months to February 22nd of 1980, and Cody's Chevrolet pickup truck was found parked in the 600 block of Iowa Street in Davenport. The truck bed was found to be full of grass, benches, snow, and other debris, and the vehicle was marked as abandoned by police. On March 3rd, the Chevrolet was towed to the Road and Wrecker Services Yard in Davenport. It was to stay there for at least 40 days before the police put it up for auction. A letter addressed to Cody, the registered owner of the car, was sent out, but it was returned unanswered. Several months later, on April 24th, two brothers named James and Richard Sperling were driving past the auction yard when they spotted the black Chevrolet truck. Back at their father's farm in Muscatine County, they had a similar truck in need of repair and thought that the Chevrolet could be used for parts. They purchased the pickup for $140 and drove it to the farm. A few hours later, the eldest brother James noticed a foul smell coming from the truck. He noticed all the muck and debris still lying in the bed, so he decided to drive the vehicle out to a field and clean it. James began shoveling out the waste when he noticed a boot sticking out from the truck bed. He attempted to pull the boot out of the pile, but realized, in horror, that it was attached to a body. Upon closer inspection, he saw there was another pair of boots next to the first. Alarmed, he ran back to the house to call the authorities. The victims in the truck were identified as two missing 30-year-old men, Gary Harker and Cody James. Davenport police estimated that the bodies had been in the truck for around 60 days. It is unclear how accurate this estimate is, however, because if Gary and Cody had been missing since December, but had only been dead for 2 months when they were found in April, then that leaves a rather large time frame in which the two men might have been alive but hadn't spoken to or seen their families. It is possible the authorities were off with their guess. Perhaps the cold winter slowed the rate of decomposition. It was determined that both Cody and Gary had been struck on the head with a wedge normally used for tree cutting. A month later, authorities announced they were looking for 3 people who they believed were involved in the double homicide. They also stated their belief that the incident was drug-related and was possibly linked with the sale of amphetamines. Police spoke with Gary's wife, Marie, who was still living in the home she shared with him in Rock Island. She had reported her husband missing on Christmas Day. She told authorities that she knew the pair were setting up drug deals for other people, but specified that her husband was not directly involved in the deals themselves. She had apparently made it very clear that she didn't want him dealing due to the risk involved. Neighbors of Gary's claimed that the 30-year-old had been dealing out of his wood carving shop, but Marie denied this. It also became clear to law enforcement, who spoke with witnesses, that Cody's truck bed had been emptied out on the morning of their disappearance, suggesting that all the debris found later had been placed there intentionally to hide the bodies. Progress in the case moved slowly from here. It was decades later, in December of 2004, on the 25th anniversary of their disappearance, that there was finally a break in the case. Detectives announced they would be looking into the murders again with fresh eyes. This came on the back of the discovery of new evidence. A friend of the two men came forward earlier in the year and handed investigators a roll of film, which had been entrusted to them by Gary and Cody shortly before their deaths. Reportedly, the two men knew they had enemies, and so they left the roll of film with a friend and told them, quote, "If anything happens to us, develop the film." After developing the images, police came to believe that the photos contained their suspects. The photos were thought to have been taken near Bolinas, a small coastal village over 18 miles north of San Francisco. Gary and Cody apparently traveled here often to gather drug supplies, and authorities believed the men lived here. The images of the unidentified men were published in local papers, with the hopes that someone would recognize the two and alert the authorities. They hoped that the passage of time would mean that less people would be fearful of the repercussions of coming forward. However, no one did ever come forward with the men's identities. There was little forensic evidence found at the scene. A soil sample was collected from the truck and tested in 2004 in order to determine if it came from the suspected murder site. Police wouldn't disclose the specific area this was, however. Additionally, one fingerprint was found on evidence inside the truck. It seems likely the print is from one of the perpetrators. It also has been mentioned in several news articles that the police knew where the men went after dropping off the air compressor. But, again, they have not made this information public. Reportedly, many of the people Gary and Cody hung out with were associated with drugs. Police believed that a drug supplier was involved and that multiple people were responsible for the murders. They reached this conclusion because they learned that the pair were known to put up a fight and were, quote, not wimps, suggesting it would have been difficult for one person to take the two on. The investigation into the murders of Gary Harker and Cody James has spanned across 5 states and several decades, but police have yet to identify any of the suspects. If you have any information about the case, you can contact the Davenport Police on 563-326-7979. Mary Ann Green. Born on January 17th of 1928, Mary Ann Amber grew up in Mahaska County, Iowa, in a home that she shared with her parents, Jenny and Claude, and her 7 siblings. Her father worked as a foreman in a local coal mine. As an adult in her mid-30s, Mary, working as a bookkeeper, married Herman Green, a businessman who owned and operated an extremely successful backhoe business in the city of Oskaloosa. The couple were married for 25 years until Herman passed away from a heart attack aged 59 on June 6th of 1987. By this point, 59-year-old Mary was already retired. Her husband's large fortune would keep her living comfortably for the rest of her life, and she lived modestly in a mobile home at Oskaloosa's Spring Creek Mobile Park on Highway 23 South. Mary and Herman had no children of their own, but they had raised her nephew Jackie as their own son, and Herman had 5 sons from his first marriage. On September 27th of 1987, one of those sons found Mary dead, collapsed on the floor in the bedroom of her home. She had been stabbed once in the chest. The 59-year-old had put up a vicious fight, as evidenced by the wounds on her fingers, which had nearly been slashed off, and before she died, Mary had crawled to the mirror on her wardrobe and written the letter N in her own blood. When Mahaska County police officers arrived on the scene, they didn't immediately rule out that the motive was robbery. The single stab wound was clearly deliberate, but not frenzied, as if fueled by anger. Sheriff Joe Beal led his officers in the investigation, accompanied by the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. Mary and Herman had been a popular couple in the area, and with Herman gone, the 59-year-old widow had continued to be well-liked by those in her neighborhood. She was friendly with locals and had a massive extended family, all of whom were shocked by the violent crime. Nobody in Mary's life knew who would want to kill her, and nobody knew what she had intended on writing on the mirror, or what the N alone meant. Police were soon made aware of how much Mary was worth, however, which led them to investigate this angle further. Friends and family estimated that the widower's estate was worth almost $1 million, and they weren't far off. Oskaloosa attorney Hugh McCoy informed police that the estate was worth $750,000. Following her death, the money was to be split evenly amongst Herbert's children and Jackie, meaning the kids were entitled to around $120,000 each. As a result of this discovery, investigators turned their attention to those who would benefit from Mary's demise. Sheriff Beal was quick to tell the media that he believed the widow's slaying was motivated by greed and money. Police theorized that one of Mary's stepsons did not want to wait for his share and sought to get rid of the 59-year-old so he could receive his share of the inheritance as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, very little evidence was uncovered during the investigation. The main item found was a knife, which was described as unusual and was discovered in the mobile home park. It was later disguised as a Remington knife with a 4.5-inch blade and was believed to have been the murder weapon. Despite this, investigators pushed forward, and eventually, on November 20th, first-degree murder charges were filed against two men. One of Herman's sons, 29-year-old Richard Lee Green, and a friend of his, 23-year-old David Kelly Yant, who lived in California. Reportedly, the two had met while Green was living there. When he heard the authorities were looking for him, Green turned himself in to the Mahaska County Sheriff's Office. He was held there under a $500,000 bond. Yant was held and charged in Ventura County Jail in Florida, in lieu of a $500,000 bond. Later that month, Yant was transported to Iowa, and both men were incarcerated at Mahaska County Jail. Police theorized that Green had hired Yant to kill his stepmother so that he could access his inheritance money. Both men entered not guilty pleas, and as the murder charge was based on a conspiracy between the two, Green and Yant were tried together. During the first trial, in July of 1988, the prosecution provided several interesting, though not quite damning, pieces of evidence. A man matching Yant's description checked into an Oskaloosa motel on the day of the murder. Additionally, he used a false name which had also allegedly been used by Green. Phone records show that Yant had had several conversations with a Green family member. 5 phone calls were found to have taken place between the two, between late August and early September. Not only this, but records showed that somebody in the Green family wired money to Yant the day before the crime. Lastly, Richard Green was known to have owned a knife similar to the Remington one found in the mobile home park. During the trial, Mary's sister-in-law testified that the 59-year-old had been confronted by one of her stepsons on the day Herman died. The stepson was upset about the will and feared that Mary would cut him out of it. Although it is unclear what specific stepson it was, the sister-in-law noted that Mary hadn't seen Richard Green in 2 years prior to his father's death. The stepson who confronted Mary is possibly Stephen, who, according to another news article, demanded that Mary gave him $50,000 following Herman's passing. Several other witnesses came forward during this first trial. One man told the court that, a week before the murder, he had overheard Yant talking about how he was going to get paid a lot of money to take a trip to Iowa, although he did not specify how much. The witness noted that he had never heard Green and Yant discuss the murder, and Yant told him directly that he was not involved in Mary's death. Meanwhile, a neighbor testified that Mary had told him she was having trouble with one of her stepsons, although, again, she did not specify which one. She told him that she was going to change her locks because of the bother she was having. It is worth noting here that there were no signs of forced entry, and the lock had not been tampered with when Mary was found in her home. Green and Yant were given 2 court-appointed defense lawyers, and were also defended by a third named Alfredo Parrish. The lawyers argued that there was no crime scene evidence which physically placed either one of the 2 defendants at the scene, and also that Yant had been hired by Green to deliver marijuana from California, not for some murder-for-hire scheme. Additionally, there was no blood on any of Yant's clothing, and none found in his car. The defense lawyers claimed that after causing such a wound, it would have been unlikely that the killer had avoided getting blood on his clothing or leaving some behind in his vehicle. It was also argued that since Mary was estimated to have died at 1 p.m. on September 27th, there was no way that Yant would have made the drive home to Ventura in the time span available. He had returned home to California at 6 p.m. the following day, while the drive between Oskaloosa and Ventura is around 26 hours. The first trial ended in a hung jury, but that didn't stop prosecutors seeking out further action. Green and Yant were tried for a second time in Polk County in October of 1988, almost a year after Mary's death. The pair were represented by the same lawyers. At the trial, Yant's father told the court that his son was an outgoing fellow who got along with everybody and anybody. Following a 14-day trial, the jury deliberated for several days. They eventually told the judge that they were deadlocked, and he dismissed them. The third and final trial occurred in January of 1989. The majority of jurors at the second trial had favored conviction, which led Iowa Attorney General Tim Miller to order a third. This time, all 3 of Green and Yant's defense lawyers requested to be removed from the case. One of them, James Blongren, told the media that defending the pair had become an economic burden that took away too much time from their other clients. He said, "A guy being defended for first-degree murder ought not to have an attorney who is concerned about the rest of his practice." However, the judge disagreed, and the 3 lawyers stayed on the case. This time, the trial was held in Washington County. Despite the best efforts of the prosecution, on March 22nd of 1989, Green and Yant were found not guilty. Following his acquittal, Richard Green moved to California. He received his share of his father's inheritance money, but had to use most of it to pay back the state of Iowa for the costs of his defense. After this verdict was found, Mary's case came to a grinding halt. It still remains unsolved. It has never been discovered what the 59-year-old intended on writing on the mirror shortly before her death, and no other suspects have ever been charged in connection with the case. Mary was buried in Forest Cemetery, Oskaloosa, alongside her husband. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. You can also support us on Patreon for as little as $2 each month. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.